all for joining me this afternoon. Obviously, welcome to the live series roundtable. Obviously, we are going to be discussing all things Gen AI and finance. I'm Sam Smith, obviously the host. I'm part of Amicus, one of the senior AI ML recruitment consultants here, having been doing that for around 5.5 years. Reason for us having this talk this evening is because I find the best way to work out with what's next in the industry and the community is by speaking with leaders such as yourself. So yeah, I'm really, really proud and happy to have such great guests this afternoon. So I'll let you all introduce yourselves, starting with Alex.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Alex. I'm the AI lead at a early stage fintech startup in compliance and regulatory fintech. We're double VC backed, and yeah, my background is just in AI ML, product development, and applied AI.
Fantastic. Will, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm CTO of a data insights startup. We primarily work with large financial customers. I run data science engineering and AI at my company. My background is actually started in ad tech and has more recently, over the past few years, moved into Gen AI and financial data.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Donghan.
Yeah, so my name is Donghan. I also go by DH. I'm the head of AI for Domeo. We're basically an AI-powered account receivable AR automation platform focusing on B2B businesses that are doing somewhere between $500 million to $1 billion in annual revenue. Very similar background to everyone else, I think. Started out as a software engineer, worked in the computer vision space for a while before coming on to this new role and being involved in this fintech industry.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining me. I suppose we'll set the scene in regards to this topic with, I suppose just what we're going to be talking about in its actual title, being AI-driven finance, building the next gen infrastructure. And I suppose the best question to ask is, what does that mean for you guys? Where are we starting with Gen AI? It's such a big thing in the market at the moment. So, yeah, how do you all see Gen AI changing what it means to build within finance, as of today?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. Yeah. I think you can look at it in two different ways, using Gen AI to build tools for finance and also applying Gen AI to finance. So if I start with using Gen AI tools, I think this is not just limited to the financial industry, but development as a whole has definitely changed over the last couple of years. What used to take 5, 10 engineers can now be done with 1 to 2 engineers that are talented and that know what they're doing. So there is that improvement in speed. When it comes to creating tools, what I've realized is the fintech industry is largely using a lot of legacy tech. And so all these new Gen AI tools that we're seeing have not really been integrated well into the financial industry so far. And so it's still, in my opinion, a very blue ocean, especially for the fintech industry. So there definitely is a lot of opportunity to integrate what we're seeing that's mainly used for the tech industry into finance.
Yeah. Just kind of on a similar note, the way that the Gen AI tools and expectations are changing the way that we build, it primarily has to do with the architecture. We're moving from a state where there were more or less even if you're working on a machine learning system, deterministic inputs, potentially not deterministic outputs. But roughly, you knew you were getting a number out and you had some data that was going in. And now you're winding up with something that has to be contained because you're working with financial customers and they need some degree of regularity and trust and safety around what your outputs are. But the inputs are entirely stochastic at different points in the system. So there's a lot more drift, and the way that you build your architecture needs to adapt to this and have observability layers and specific types of monitoring to make sure that things maintain within the constraints that your customers have.
Yeah, I also want to add on that I think that there is an inclination now to build faster because we can, and especially, as DH pointed out, a lot of these financial firms are dealing with legacy systems. So there's this change of kind of mindset that now I can, just build on the cutting edge and build really fast. But I think what needs to happen is that we take a step back and actually build slower and smarter upfront, right? So it's like, how do you balance where we have technology now with kind of where we need it to be to handle kind of hand walking and slowly moving with um, yeah, just pausing to build properly, right, for things that are regulated.
Yeah, I think we've all touched upon one key thing that caught my attention there was this notion of legacy systems. And obviously, there's a huge gap now, isn't there, between traditional banking, traditional finance, and these legacy things that have been in place for so many years, and what is now cutting edge. Obviously, we all love to build brand new, and we all love to build quick and build teams that are right at the forefront. But you said taking that step back, where do you see, or for yourself being in the industry, what's one thing that is like preventing that at a whole scale? That what's one thing that you're seeing when applying these new products and these new tools to those legacy systems? What's a big challenge within that?
Yeah, I would say change management is the hardest problem, especially like our company is enterprise B2B, and so it's like how do you enable AI and tech and digital literacy in a company that's not yours, right? With people that are not who you're necessarily working with every day. And I think this still holds true if you are like doing enablement internally too. So it's like how do you kind of meet people where they are, make sure that fears, right? About being replaced or just not knowing and having all of this information coming at you, like how do you just to handle that from like a people and process perspective, and then also how do you educate people on the technology as well, not necessarily this is AI and this is the math behind it, but this is how it's used for either a product or productivity gains or things like that. So I think there's just like that kind of development with people that needs to be addressed as well, and not only thinking about product or tech development as well.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, so
I definitely. Sorry, go ahead, Will.
no, no, you go ahead. You believe we're speaking first.
Yeah.
You're stream pro, so.
I think I definitely agree with everything Alex said. I think in addition to that, my viewpoint is how with a lot of these legacy tools, they're using not necessarily uniform data structure. So every different ERP, for example, has their own data, have their own way of storing and managing data that they've been doing for the past however many decades. So there's no way we're going to come in and say, change the way that you're handling your data just so that we can allow more AI tools. That's now the responsibility of fintech companies, of these newer companies that are trying to integrate AI tools. So really trying to figure out, okay, we have all these different ERPs that all of our customers are using. How can we unify this? Because we need to have a unified data structure in order for us to build AI tools on top of that.
Right. Yeah. So very similar. Our customers absolutely want their data sandboxed away from one another. And when it comes to training an AI model, which thrives on having a significant amount of data fed to it, the natural inclination is to rely on things like shared vector stores, other shared databases. And there's a real limitation that gets introduced because obviously we have to be compliant with the way the customer wants us to use their data. And often that means that, well, just don't mix it. And so you have to get creative around building those structures. And simultaneously, as DH is saying, you want a shared data structure, but you need this multi-tenant style architecture that just introduces a larger degree of complexity in the way that you can process data.
And I suppose with although the complexity that's coming, sort of having those sort of teams in place to make sure you're building in the correct way, is that a bit of a bottleneck in its own right in terms of having the right sort of skill sets to ensure you're following the best practices and sort of doing the right things itself?
I wouldn't say it's a skill set thing more than it is like a mindset thing because especially dealing with larger teams, maybe teams that are more siloed off or working collaboratively but not under like the same manager or something, you end up in a situation where best practices means different things and are upheld differently. So obviously everyone has their idea of that, but there is usually one standard, one golden standard. So it's like kind of like how do you make that like available to everyone and kind of get everyone on the same page, right? Because for the most part, I'd say like you're either pretty much coming in as a skilled engineer or you can use AI to get there, right? And like that's the beautiful thing about engineering right now. But if you don't know how to check your work, check for the quality of code coming out from, other engineers or AI, then you don't know how to build your system in the most like integrous way, right?
It's something actually I had a meeting with last year here, one of our meetups in person. It was around sort of implying or applying, sorry, these tools to wider teams. And that golden set of standards was one thing that was covered, and one thing that engineering leaders and managers at the time were really struggling with in terms of how to ensure that you are doing the right things as a wider team, but then how do you ensure that even within the same company, those teams are also doing the best practices and also following the right things that they should be when applying these tools to, especially obviously within finance, with the security, governance, compliance that it needs to have. How have you been tackling, and this goes obviously to everyone, by the way, how have you been tackling making sure that teams cross businesses and cross functions are, yeah, following the right set of principles?
I'd
I
say
think
from
go ahead. Sorry, I think
yeah, well,
we're in sync.
yeah, that's right. We have the same pause
Exactly.
before
Yeah.
we start talking. Uh, so I think it really helps that we're a small startup in this regard. There's a significant amount less code entropy, and we've actually been able to manage this by having a set of standards, especially around observability and multi-tenancy. And so that's worked for us so far, and it's nice, back to the startup piece of it, that we have a relatively small engineering team, so it's really just part of the culture at this point, that we have the checklist. Okay, well, can we check each LLM output to see what it is, and then see what it gets transformed into? I'd imagine in larger organizations that gets significantly more difficult, or if you're trying to start building, given that you had a large organization. I don't know if other folks have comments there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'm in a very similar situation with Will. Domeo is a very lean startup. So obviously the size definitely helps, but what we try to do is we try to make sure that all of our engineers are following best practices by documenting all the different things that we're doing. And I think this is very key for when the organization grows. We're SOC 2 compliant, and we want to make sure that we follow all these compliance rules. And the best way to onboard new engineers is to show them a very concise, neat document that kind of illustrates, this is how we develop, this is how we're supposed to use AI tools, and these are the design principles that we want to follow. And just ensuring that everyone is clear on how we're supposed to develop in an industry that is very privacy and security focused.
Yeah. I wanted to also add that I think documentation is like a great starting point, and our team is also very small. But something I've noticed, especially when you're onboarding like more junior engineers as well, is that it's really useful to do paired programming and kind of do peer programming code review together, so that you can be there in real time to be a coach and be a mentor and explain like why something is a better way to do it versus the alternatives. And so that way you're kind of like helping to build trust, right, with your team, but also you're kind of solidifying why that documentation exists in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's sort of almost shoehorned in the next segment we wanted to talk about anyway, fantastically, which is obviously trust, security, and compliance. And sort of, especially when building for the future, obviously, trustworthiness of AI is a massive thing that I'm certainly seeing right in the whole, in the wider market, let alone across sort of the regulated sectors we all operate in. So I suppose when we're looking at building for trustworthiness and actually getting our systems to operate the way we look at, is there anything that anyone's applying as like groundwork to make sure that is something that's built into the system as we go?
Yeah, I think Will touched on this earlier, but definitely like just adding monitoring and observability into your workflows and your agents like helps a lot. Something that's been helping a lot with our enterprise clients is just showing that there's an audit trail, right? Because we are in financial compliance and regulation, they're going to be audited by the SEC or FINRA. Like they have to have this sort of like change log of everything that's going on with the agents and with the system. So what I do from kind of like a data perspective is just everything that goes into some model or some function is every input is tracked, every change that happens within those function is tracked, and every output is tracked and saved and stored and has a retention period so that you can always go back and see what's going on.
Yeah,
Right.
I think
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so right, the only thing I'd add to that, because I completely agree, Alex. Those are key components. There is the monitoring of just quantitative monitoring of bias and drift of the models over time, so that they create a consistent, so that you can detect if they're creating consistent outputs, right? And there's a variety of different metrics you could dig into from a sort of technical perspective there. But at a high level, as part of the observability piece, you need to have quantitative metrics and alerting on those metrics if distributions all of a sudden change. And that way, it's not a one-to-one, right? So there's false positives, false negatives in these sorts of processes, but they give you an idea of where to look and if things are in general looking okay, and allow you to hop into the right part of the system when something does go wrong.
Yeah, and I think for us, we always try to make sure that we're very transparent with the clients that we work with. Obviously, things like software compliance, these are nice badges to have to give them additional comfortability to kind of reassure them that their data is being protected and we are using best practices. I think Will mentioned about using multi-tenant structures. That's obviously a very good architecture to use to ensure that you don't have any contamination across your client's data. But yeah, I'm supporting what Alex said, monitoring and logging. These are very important processes that you need to have in order to even get SOC 2 compliance. So just making sure that we have a clean line of communication and that we're communicating with our clients and that that they know exactly how their data is being used is what I think is a very good way to build trust.
And I suppose just building on top of that as well, with all the changes and how sort of rapid the iteration of these new models are that are coming out, specifically, I suppose, with Gen AI, how can we ensure then, as teams are innovating and trying to build their next sort of level on top of the products we're building, how can we ensure that things are still controlled, still regulated, and sort of stable from that side?
Yeah, so I have a science background, so my answer is keep experimenting with these things, right? You can't just say I'm going to plug one model in and I'll just wait for that to get deprecated and then I'll put the other one in. I think at the same time, while you're innovating and while you're testing all of these models, you don't just test one, right? You test the full suite of them. And also for my specific use cases, this is because we're an enterprise B2B solution. Everyone's using different models. People have different providers that they work with or that they pay for. So it really has to be like a kind of like mix. Like I call it a smoothie of models. So yeah, that's the way I would approach that.
Right. Similar to that, we use for pressure testing our products as we roll them out to market, we use a human in the loop interaction, where effectively the operators at our company have a dashboard where they can see what happens at each layer of the model, and it's run across a number of different publicly available selections of model. And we use that as part of our model optimization process and also our consistency process. Now, there tends to be particular LLMs that win out pretty regularly, but occasionally we depend on different providers to process at different parts in our system.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, DH, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I think what's really nice about the financial industry, I'll say, is unlike, let's say, computer vision, where you're dealing with images, it's very easy to create accurate synthetic data. So what we do is we have a data set that doesn't really belong to any clients. That's essentially fake data. And we like to test our models on these fake data. And so I would say more than 50% of the models that we actually end up developing don't go into production because we've tested with our synthetic data sets, which is fine because it's complete fake. And the ones that pass that level of testing are the ones that end up going to production. And what I realized with the finance industry is when you're using synthetic data, you can kind of bypass all those kind of security compliances because we're doing everything locally using fake data that doesn't really belong to anyone. So that's one way to speed up the development, try out a lot of different models, and to see which one will work. And those candidates will later on be launched to production, and then there'll be a different kind of monitoring that needs to be done to ensure that they do well in the real world based on the hypothesis of the simulated data.
And I suppose with obviously looking at workarounds and looking at sort of things that people are experimenting on, a big thing that is obviously in sort of the topic of AI at the moment is obviously cost. And that's obviously not just from an energy perspective, but a monetary perspective. How big is that playing an impact on obviously which models people are using and sort of how much change and experimentation is needing to take place? And do you see that changing at all going forward with, as we all know, these models will continue to rise in cost, I suppose, going forward? Like, is there any changes people are seeing?
I mean, something I pretty much work with every day is the trade-off between, do I use an open source model and then that, is hosted differently than if I'm using a foundational model that I can just throw an API key in and like ping one API with that. Again, it's hard to say because for me it's very client dependent. But I would say that cost is a factor when just trying to get that first contract signed with someone, right? But then what happens that I've seen is that usually there's not really much of a trade-off with latency as there is with accuracy, right? Because open source models they tend to be a little bit more hallucinating and maybe a little less sophisticated than the latest like foundational model that you can get from like Anthropic or OpenAI, something like that. So it's always just like a balance. And again, with me, it's how much is the client willing to trade off in either direction.
I think if you had an infinite amount of money, then obviously the solution would be to always use the best models. But for smaller companies, that's not an option. And what I've realized is instead of focusing so much on getting better models, sometimes using smart engineering can also produce the same level of accuracy without having to upgrade or use bigger models. So for example, if you're creating some kind of chatbot, let's say, instead of trying to find a model that has a huge context window, maybe the right approach would be to engineer a RAG pipeline so that you extract the relevant context so the chatbot can still answer your question, even if the underlying model itself is much smaller.
Yeah, and so from a user interaction, so I think about this from a user interaction perspective. Often my concern is latency to the user, and that influences some of my decisions. Part of that is because we have direct user interaction with our LLMs in real time, and the costs there's a pretty big gap, right? If you want to host a very advanced model on a fancy GPU box in Amazon, that's a considerable cost every month. Alternatively, if you want a slower solution, you can go and use a pretty nice model with an API key, and so the costs do matter, and it depends on the application. So, for example, we have some batch applications that we run where we actually take open-ended responses to survey questions, run them in a batch pipeline, and have basically an agent organize them into buckets. It works rather well. We can use a slow but good model. However, we have a chat interface in our product, and that requires a lighter weight model with a higher latency constraints, or more severe latency constraints, and finding the right cost trade-offs for those is something that's a big consideration for us.
And I suppose then when we look at obviously cost trade-offs apply all across sort of not only the models we use, but also how we're applying these tools for the teams that we're building as well. So looking at I suppose scaling and working with AI as almost as a co-engineer or co-pilot. We mentioned, I think, right at the start that this is happening. We are using models and using sort of agentic AI to help teams sort of grow or use them as sort of like almost sort of second engineers. What's one thing that we're seeing in your own development and or your team's development where sort of Gen AI is transforming sort of engineering workflows, and how are we seeing that sort of apply into sort of building out sort of finance products?
Yeah, I think I saw somewhere on YouTube where, when ChatGPT first came out, it was prompt engineering. Now they're kind of moving over to something called spec engineering, where you're giving these AI tools the correct spec, and you're not just giving it short prompts here and there to fix one function here and one function there. When it comes to the pricing of these tools, it's actually very cheap, because if you could, if you think about a full-time software engineer working in New York City, let's say, you're looking at somewhere around $150,000 a year in salary that you have to pay. Whereas these AI tools, you can get Claude Code with the max subscription for $100 a month. So there is this kind of big difference. And I'm not trying to say that AI tools are better than human engineers. We definitely do need human engineers. But it kind of gives you that extra push where you become so much more effective for a very cheap price.
Yeah. My observation there, as every single engineer on my team uses an AI assistant, whether that be Claude Code or Cursor, what have you, is that especially for junior engineers, I like to think of it as increasing their blast radius, right? Which can either be a very great thing when the place you want to blast is clearly defined and you really want to blast it, but it also in the wrong situation can be troublesome, and really the currency that we have to transact on more so in our engineering department after these coding tools have come through is the judgment, typically from the senior engineers, of what a good idea and what a bad idea looks like. And it's really changed the conversation in code reviews, right? It's more of instead of, oh, hey, for junior engineers, the conversation of, oh, hey, you should really do it like this. Or, if you want to get from A to B, that's, you should, maybe this part of your code was good and that part of your code wasn't, to developing their judgment earlier on in the employee lifecycle. So that's my big observation in terms of the AI coding tools. That they're extremely powerful. I know they help my coding when I wind up coding, but with the great power comes great responsibility and the need for good judgment.
Yeah, definitely. I think I 100% agree with what Will just said. You can use AI tools and it'll spit out a bunch of code, but you always have to do double, triple check to ensure that the code that's being produced is of the right quality and is not doing something stupid. And that, again, falls to the responsibility of the more senior engineers to ensure that we're fine using a lot of AI tools and we can allow the junior engineers to increase their blast radius, but let's always also make sure that we know what we're actually pushing to prod, and making sure that when we do these code reviews, the code that's being pushed out is correct, essentially.
And I suppose with Will, just drawing back onto your point around sort of obviously the mindset and that of an engineer and how they can sort of do that. How would you identify shortfalls in that as a leader, and what's what I know we're going slightly off topic here, but what's one of the things that you like to implement, I suppose, as a leader to ensure that you are picking up on those points early on enough to be able to help the more junior and I suppose more some of the senior engineers as well.
A lot of this is really contained in the existing code review process. It just, like I said, it changed the conversation a bit, right? It changed the conversation from, hey, here's this little technical detail to we're having junior engineers enter systems conversations much earlier than they would have previously, right? But it was more like, okay, well, we're going to teach you, you're crawling right now. We're going to teach you to walk. It's more like, okay, well, you're walking at a high rate of speed with very wobbly legs. Let's teach you the places where you can walk. A little bit of a stretch metaphor there, but I think I think it conveys the idea here, right? It's like, okay, well, they're so much more able. They can do so many more things. The conversation in the code review is like, are those things worth doing, and should you do them? Right. So, but largely, GitHub has served this purpose pretty well. It's really just changed the things that we talked about in GitHub, and then obviously the value of the judgment of the senior engineers is able to be used much more often, and so in that sense is more valuable, despite the fact that it was always valuable.
Excellent. And I suppose sort of moving on to what would be that, I suppose our last little segment is the road ahead. What's next? There's so many things emerging, obviously from sort of agentic-based finance to obviously autonomous systems completely. Where do we see sort of the biggest architectural sort of struggles, I suppose, going forward with these new systems? And is there anything that if we were to meet again in a couple of years, you'd have said this is the biggest problem we solved, whether that be internally or we solved as I suppose, a community?
Yeah, so my hot take is I think we're going to see a trend shifting away from using large language models, and a lot of these startups, especially, are going to move towards small language models, and that's going to be like the startup's defensible moat, right? Like right now, we are seeing Claude, for example, is able to hit some of these more specific industry use cases in healthcare and finance, right? Because these giant models are able to swallow this up. But like we've talked about before, like the cost of this is going to become insane, especially for agentic orchestrations where you're pinging LLMs constantly, right? So what I think is going to happen in a couple of years is that people are going to end up having their own hardware on-prem again, and they're going to be able to train smaller models through knowledge transfer or diffusion learning from these larger ones for more specific tasks in finance, which I think is going to just help the field more than using a larger model, because you'll be able to have these trained LLMs that are really good at, being guardrailed and really good about being more deterministic, knowing that they can never be 100% for whatever task that they're doing.
Anyone else with a hot take at all?
Yeah, so my thoughts here is I agree, more specialized models and more agentic flows. So more businesses are going to thrive on the fact that they're very good at making particular sets of decisions. So in my case, it's a decision about how data should be interpreted and how you would reach out to different specialized models to do the interpretation of the data to make it relevant, and what sorts of information you'd pull from other pieces of our knowledge base, along with the action plans that we associate with our data right now. And so I imagine in DH's use case, which obviously you should speak to, it's going to be what actions to take in the sort of the accounts receivable space. But fundamentally, it's just this idea of specialized models making decisions and then carrying through with some sort of action on the other end. And then furthermore, having that be auditable and something where you can actually trace the decision-making process as if a human had done it.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both Alex and Will. And my hot take is very similar to Alex's, where I think large language models is really dead at this point. I think Jan McClune also mentioned it a while ago on his social media saying, I'm not focused on large language models anymore. And I somewhat agree. I think it's amazing what we've been able to see with large language models. I'm not trying to take anything away from that research, but we've come to a point where if your goal is to build a business within the financial industry, it's not really about creating another larger language model, but more so about focusing on using smaller models for agentic workflows and trying to figure out, okay, what does my customer do on a day-to-day basis? How can I use a smaller language model to automate that workflow? And so we're trying to figure out, and I think a lot of fintech companies are trying to figure out the use cases and the workflows of their customers. And to me, I think that will be the next challenge for the next couple of years.
Amazing. Well, hopefully we can sort of touch base in 2 years again and see if our predictions were true, or if they come any sooner. As I imagine they probably will, especially with how quick everything is iterating. But obviously that's all we've got time for this afternoon. And I myself obviously picked up a lot of things there that I'll certainly take into the rest of the calls when I speak with various of our clients of what is next. And I hope you all have taken something away, and hopefully obviously the audience, as and when people listen to this, will also have some learning points. But thank you so much, all of you. Obviously I can't wait to pick this up at a later date as well. But have a great evening, and hopefully we'll speak soon.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.